It started with a call to 911 that no one in Ashfield County would ever forget. A woman's voice, trembling, distant, almost like she was calling from the bottom of a well. She said her husband had vanished in the middle of the night. Her words were slow, careful, too careful. "He just walked out," she whispered, "and never came back." But when deputies arrived, they didn't find a trail or footprints, or even a sign of struggle. What they did find was an open back door, a half-drunk glass of bourbon, and a pair of muddy boots by the fireplace. It didn't add up. Samuel Reed wasn't the kind of man who left things unfinished. People in town said he was solid, the kind of husband who fixed his neighbors' roofs, who sent money to his mother every month, who never once raised his voice at anyone, the kind of man who believed in promises. And yet, in a single night, he had become a ghost. His wife, Claire, said she'd last seen him around 10 p.m. "He looked tired," she told the deputy, "said he needed some air." Her eyes were red, her voice quiet. Everyone felt sorry for her. For a while, at least, because grief has a way of bending truth, and people started noticing that Claire's tears came easy when eyes were watching. But when she thought no one could see, her face changed. "Hello there, welcome to our story. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredibly special knowing our stories are resonating with people across the globe. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss our next story." 3 days later, the search dogs picked up a scent near the woods behind their house. The trail led to an old patch of ground, soft and uneven. The deputies stopped digging when they hit wood, a piece of Samuel's workbench, broken in two. But underneath it, nothing. Just dirt, damp and heavy. They assumed he'd gone deeper into the forest, that he'd wandered off in confusion. But one old miner who'd known Samuel shook his head. He said, "No man just disappears. He's here somewhere. She just don't want him found." Now Ashfield was a small town, the kind where people talk over fences and everyone knows who's fighting and who's fine. Claire had always been the quiet one. Moved there just 4 years ago from the city, young, charming, a little too perfect. And Samuel, well, he was 15 years older, already thinking about retirement. Folks said they made an odd pair. But to Claire, Samuel was safety. He had a small fortune from land sales, a nice home by the creek, and a gentle heart that trusted too easily. To the outside world, they were happy. Inside, though, there were cracks, money arguments, whispers of another man, a husband who sensed something was wrong but couldn't bring himself to believe it. 6 weeks after Samuel's disappearance, Claire held a memorial in their backyard. Friends gathered, candles flickered, and the wind carried faint sounds from the trees. She stood there in black, reading a letter she claimed Samuel had written years ago. "If I ever go before you," it said, "remember that love is stronger than time." Her voice broke on the last line. People wept. But when everyone left, a neighbor across the creek noticed Claire doing something strange. She was digging, alone, long after midnight. You see, love can make people do beautiful things, but it can also make them blind. And in that blindness, we sometimes bury more than we mean to. That night, the wind howled like it carried a secret, and the ground behind the Reed home lay freshly turned. By morning, Claire had gone back to smiling for the neighbors. She even opened Samuel's old hardware store, saying she wanted to honor his memory. But there was something about the way she said it, like she already knew his memory wasn't done with her. 2 months later, it began. Scratches on the back door, footsteps in the hall when she was alone, a muddy handprint on the mirror. She called the sheriff again, swearing someone was stalking her. But when they checked the property, nothing. No signs of a break-in. Only those boots, Samuel's boots, moved from the fireplace to the porch. Now here's the thing. The mind can play tricks under guilt. But sometimes, it's not the mind at all. Sometimes it's the truth clawing its way back up. And as Claire began losing sleep, as her laughter turned into quiet muttering, people started wondering if Samuel Reed was truly gone, or if he was closer than anyone dared to believe. So let me ask you this. What would you do if the person you betrayed came back for the truth? If the one thing you thought was buried wasn't? Would you confess, or would you keep digging deeper, praying the past stays silent? Because in Ashfield County, silence doesn't last forever. They say there's no such thing as secrets in a small town, but Ashfield proved them wrong. The morning after Claire's second call to the sheriff, word spread faster than the wind that tore through those empty cornfields. Folks at the diner stopped talking when her name came up. Some pitied her, a young widow haunted by grief. Others whispered darker things. One man claimed he'd seen her car parked by the old quarry late one night, engine running, headlights off. Another swore he heard a woman screaming near the riverbed days before Samuel's disappearance. Nobody could prove a thing, but everyone could feel it. Something wasn't right. The sheriff tried to close the case, but he couldn't shake that feeling either. He'd known Samuel for 20 years, shared coffee with him every Sunday after church. He wasn't the type to just walk off, he said quietly to his deputy. And the deputy nodded because he'd seen something that didn't make sense. In the middle of the woods, about a mile from the Reeds' property, a patch of ground had been disturbed. The soil was dark and heavy, still damp despite the lack of rain. He didn't mention it in the report. Maybe he didn't want to believe what it meant. Claire, meanwhile, seemed to be moving on too quickly. She started wearing bright colors again, smiling at strangers, spending money freely, money that used to make Samuel's hands shake when he signed checks. Within weeks, she'd sold his truck, closed his accounts, and begun seeing a man from out of town. People noticed the new necklace she wore, real gold, something Samuel could never have afforded. When asked where she got it, she said it was a gift from an old friend. But old friends don't show up in the middle of the night. And that's when the questions started. What really happened the night Samuel disappeared? Why was Claire so calm when the police left? What was she burying behind that house? And who was the man who came by after dark, always leaving before dawn? The sheriff kept returning to that muddy patch in the woods. Something about it wouldn't leave his mind. He went back one evening, shovel in hand, the sun setting low behind the trees. He dug just enough to see what was beneath. It wasn't a body, at least not all of one. It was Samuel's watch, cracked, still ticking faintly when he found it. He froze, staring at the second hand, as it made one last desperate click. Back in town, Claire was at her kitchen window, sipping wine, humming a song she used to sing when Samuel was alive. But when she looked up, her glass slipped from her hand. There, in the reflection, behind her shoulder, mud. Just a faint streak, like a hand had pressed against the glass. She turned around, heart racing. Nothing. Empty room. But the air felt different. Thick, heavy, like it remembered something she'd tried to forget. And that's when people started asking questions no one wanted answered. What was Samuel trying to tell them from the grave he was never found in? Why did Claire dream of the same spot in the woods every night, hearing her name whispered from below? What was it that made her dig in secret? And what had she buried that still refused to stay quiet? Tell me, if it were you, if the earth beneath your feet began to whisper the name of the person you wronged, would you listen? Or would you keep pretending you couldn't hear it because some truths don't stay buried, they just wait? Before the whispers, before the sleepless nights. There was a man who believed love could fix anything. Samuel Reed was the kind of person who lived by habit, the same brand of coffee every morning, the same drive to his hardware shop, the same seat on the church pew every Sunday. His life was simple, maybe even ordinary, but it was the kind of ordinary that gave him peace. He'd built everything with his own hands, the house by the creek, the shelves in his store, even the garden fence that leaned slightly to one side, but still stood strong after 20 years. He was proud of that fence, because it reminded him of himself, imperfect but steady. When Claire came into his life, she was everything he wasn't. Young, ambitious, full of laughter that filled every quiet corner of his world. She'd moved from the city, chasing escape more than opportunity. She met Samuel at a town fundraiser, her red dress the only spark of color in a room full of gray suits and polite smiles. He offered her a drink, nervous but kind, and she smiled like she already knew what he was thinking. Within months they were inseparable. To the townsfolk, it seemed like a love story meant to be, the lonely craftsman and the city dreamer who taught him how to live again. But those who looked closer saw the difference. Samuel looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered. Claire looked at him like he was the last step before something better. Their marriage was quiet, almost too quiet. At first she said she loved the peace, the sound of the creek at night, the smell of pine after rain. But soon the quiet started to suffocate her. She missed the city lights, the noise, the faces that didn't all know her name. Samuel didn't notice at first. He thought her long walks were for reflection, not escape. He thought her late nights reading was simply restlessness. But sometimes love blinds us more than hate ever could. He didn't see the way she flinched when he mentioned children, or how her smile never quite reached her eyes when he spoke about growing old together. 6 months into their marriage, Samuel changed the beneficiary on his life insurance. He told the agent it was just in case something happened. "I want her to be safe," he said. The agent nodded, printed the papers, and never thought of it again. But those papers would later become the key to everything. Claire found them one afternoon, tucked in the drawer beside his ledger. She sat there for a long time, staring at his signature, so neat, so trusting, and something inside her shifted. For the first time she realized what that trust was worth. Around that time people noticed she started dressing differently. New clothes, fresh perfume, a touch of makeup she never wore before. She said it was to feel like herself again, but there was more to it. Samuel noticed too. "You look beautiful," he'd tell her with that gentle smile of his. And she'd nod, but her eyes would drift somewhere far beyond him, like she was already thinking about a life without his shadow. There were good moments, of course, a few at least, like the time they danced in the living room when the power went out. She laughed when he stepped on her toes, and for a second, it felt real. But even then, something was missing. A quiet gap between them, filled with everything left unsaid. Because Claire wasn't just restless, she was planning. And Samuel, too kind to see it, kept building her a life she didn't want. Sometimes the most dangerous kind of betrayal doesn't start with hate. It starts with silence. The kind where one person keeps loving and the other keeps pretending. And as the months passed, that silence grew heavy. It filled the house, the air, even their dreams. Until one day, Claire stopped pretending altogether. It was a Sunday evening when everything began to turn. Samuel had spent the day fixing a neighbor's fence, came home with dust on his boots, and found Claire sitting by the window staring out at the trees. She didn't hear him come in. The radio was playing something slow, an old country song that used to make her smile. But this time she didn't move, just sat there, glass of wine in hand, watching the light fade behind the hills. He asked if she was all right, and she nodded, though her eyes never left that window. Something about that moment stayed with him, the stillness of it, the way she seemed almost waiting for something that wasn't him. That week, the small things began to change. The coffee tasted different in the mornings, a little more bitter. Samuel told himself it was the brand. The dinners she made grew simpler, quieter. She stopped sitting with him afterward, stopped asking about his day. When she laughed, it felt rehearsed, and sometimes when he came home early from the store, he'd catch her on the phone, whispering, then hanging up too fast. He never asked who it was. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe he still believed love could outlast whatever shadow was passing over them. But one night, that shadow became impossible to ignore. Samuel woke to the sound of footsteps, light, cautious, moving across the creaky floorboards. The clock read 2:47 a.m. He called her name, but there was no answer. The front door opened, then closed softly. He sat up, staring into the dark, heart pounding. When she returned, she smelled faintly of smoke and rain. He asked where she'd gone, and she said she couldn't sleep, that she needed air. Her voice was calm, too calm. He looked at her for a long time, and though he said nothing, something in him began to crack. Over the next few days, he grew quieter. He started keeping a small notebook, jotting things down, times, dates, small details that didn't make sense. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. He'd loved her enough to notice the lies, even when she was careful to hide them. And then came the wine. His favorite bottle, opened one evening after dinner. She poured 2 glasses, smiled that soft smile she used to wear when they first met, and told him she wanted a new beginning. "We've both made mistakes," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound real. He believed her. Of course he did. The next morning, he didn't show up at the shop. His assistant thought maybe he was sick. By afternoon, his truck was still parked outside the house, keys on the counter, phone in the drawer. Claire said he'd gone for a walk and hadn't come back. That night, she didn't call the police. She waited until morning, just long enough to make the story sound right. But there was something she hadn't planned for. When the deputies came to search the property, one of them found Samuel's wallet behind the shed. Inside was a note, written in shaky handwriting. Just one line. "If I go missing, start here." And so they did. The ground behind the shed was soft, turned recently. The sheriff dug until his hands hit something solid, a piece of rope, snapped clean in the middle. But no body, no blood, just the scent of earth, and something else, like iron, faint and cold. Claire stood a few yards away, tears in her eyes, but her hands were clean. Too clean. From that night on, no one saw Samuel Reed again, at least not alive. After the police left, the house felt heavier. Claire sat in the living room, lights off, wrapped in Samuel's old work jacket. The smell of sawdust still clung to it, faint but familiar. She told herself it was comfort she wanted, but deep down, it was control. The sheriff had said they'd keep searching, but she knew they wouldn't find him, at least not where she'd put him. The earth was deep, the current of the river strong enough to erase mistakes. That's what she thought. But guilt doesn't wash away. It seeps. It clings. It whispers. The nights were the worst. She'd lie awake, hearing the floorboards creak, even when the wind was still. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, slow, dragging, deliberate. Once she swore she heard breathing. She turned every lock twice, checked every corner, but the sound would always come from behind her. When she'd spin around, nothing, just silence. And that silence began to feel alive. Days passed, but the town didn't move on. At the diner, people spoke softer now when she walked in. Someone carved Samuel's initials into a post outside the hardware store. The sheriff stopped by more often, pretending it was routine, but his eyes lingered on the smallest things. Mud on her boots, the bruises on her wrists she couldn't explain. Claire played the part well. Tears when needed, kindness when expected. But when she was alone, she drank more. The house grew messier. The mirror in the hallway cracked, though she couldn't remember when. And one morning, when she went to pour herself a drink, she froze. On the counter sat Samuel's watch, the one they'd never recovered. Its glass was shattered, but it was ticking. That night she called the man she'd been seeing, the one from out of town, the one who promised her freedom. His voice was cold now, distant. He said he couldn't come anymore, that too many eyes were watching. She shouted, begged, then hung up. She smashed the phone against the wall, the pieces scattered. But in the echo of her rage, she heard it again, a faint knock, 3 times at the back door. She stood frozen. The handle rattled, softly, like someone testing it. She called out, but no one answered. When she finally opened the door, there was nothing, just a trail of wet footprints leading away toward the trees. The next day, she found the garden gate wide open. Mud tracked across the porch. Her heart raced, but she told herself it was kids, maybe animals, until she saw the prints were too large, too heavy. And there, beside the gate, was a half-buried ring. Samuel's wedding band. She dropped to her knees, staring at it, her breath coming fast. For a long time she didn't move. The fear was something she couldn't name anymore. It wasn't about getting caught. It was about being seen. The nightmares began after that. She'd wake, drenched in sweat, convinced she could still taste dirt in her mouth. In one dream, she saw him standing in the doorway, soaked, eyes dark, saying nothing, just watching. When she'd wake, She'd hear the same song playing from the radio, an old tune Samuel used to hum while working in the shed, but the radio wasn't plugged in. Soon she stopped going outside. The curtains stayed drawn. Calls went unanswered. The only sound left in that house was the ticking of that broken watch. People said she'd gone strange, but no one dared to visit anymore. A few brave kids claimed they saw a figure in the window some nights, a man's shadow, tall, unmoving, standing just behind her. The sheriff tried to check once more, but by the time he arrived, the house was empty. The front door swung open, her shoes still by the mat. Now tell me, what would you have done if you were her? If the person you thought you buried began to visit in the quiet? If every lie you told came back in footsteps, in whispers, in the sound of a heartbeat beneath the floorboards? Would you run, confess, or just wait, for the knock you know is coming? Because for Claire Reed, that knock was only the beginning. It was nearly 3 months after Samuel's disappearance when the truth finally began to crawl its way back to the surface. By then, Claire was barely recognizable. Her once perfect posture had wilted into a hunch, her face pale, her eyes haunted by nights of staring into the dark and seeing it stare back. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and when she did sleep, she dreamed of the same thing: mud, heavy and cold, pressing against her skin. As a voice whispered her name from beneath it, she'd wake up gasping for air, clawing at her throat like she was the one buried. That winter was harsh. The river froze in places it hadn't before, and strange things began washing up along the banks: shards of wood, rope, an old boot that locals swore looked just like Samuel's. The sheriff tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but there were too many coincidences. He'd been reviewing Samuel's old notebook, the one they'd found tucked under the floorboard. The last entry read, "If anything happens, it won't be by chance." That single sentence stuck with him, kept him awake some nights. It was as if Samuel had known something, as if he'd been afraid of the person sleeping beside him. Meanwhile, the sounds in the Reed house grew louder. Neighbors said they heard furniture dragging across the floors at night, lights flickering through the curtains, the faint echo of a man's voice calling from inside. Claire stopped answering the door, but one night the sheriff received a call. A neighbor said Claire was screaming. When he arrived, the house was cold, windows open, wind rushing through the halls. She was standing in the middle of the living room, barefoot, covered in dirt, staring at something that wasn't there. He asked what happened, but she didn't answer. Her lips trembled, her eyes fixed on the back door. Finally, she whispered, "He's back." At first, he thought she'd lost her mind, until he saw it, the footprints, muddy, clear, leading from the door straight toward her. And there was one more thing, the smell of damp earth, thick in the air, like the ground itself had been turned over. He followed the tracks outside, across the yard, down toward the river. They stopped at the same patch of ground that had been disturbed months before. And there, just at the edge of the frost, was a handprint, fresh. When he returned, Claire was gone. The house stood empty again, only the echo of her last words hanging in the cold. The next morning, fishermen found something caught in the reeds, a body or what was left of one. They couldn't identify it at first. The current had taken its toll, but wrapped around the wrist was that same cracked watch, the one that never stopped ticking. Samuel Reed's. They buried him properly that time. Closed casket, no ceremony. But when they went to tell Claire, she was nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, until one evening, a woman matching her description appeared at a motel 2 towns over, drenched, shivering, muttering the same phrase over and over again. "He won't stay down." No one knows what really happened that night by the river. Some say she drowned herself trying to escape what she'd done. Others believe she saw him again, that somehow in that cold winter night Samuel came home one last time. But I'll tell you this. A few months after she vanished, a new family bought the Reed house. They didn't know the story, not at first, but after the first rain of spring, the husband said he found something strange while planting in the backyard. A ring. 2 of them, melted together. And from that day on, every clock in that house ticked just a little too loud. Spring came slow that year, like the town itself was holding its breath. The sheriff retired not long after the final report on Samuel Reed's case was filed. No charges, no conclusion, just an empty space where the truth should have been. People stopped asking questions. That's how small towns heal, not by finding answers, but by pretending they never needed them. Still, the Reed house stood like a scar on the edge of the woods, paint peeling, weeds growing through the cracks of the porch, the faint rattle of wind through loose shutters. But some nights when the moon hung low, neighbors said they saw a flicker of light from the upstairs window. Maybe the new owners forgot to turn something off, or maybe it was something else, something unfinished. The family who lived there didn't last long. The husband, a teacher, started hearing strange noises coming from the basement, like hammering, slow and steady, the sound of wood being built. He thought it was the pipes, until he found a wall that shouldn't have been there. Behind it, buried in the dirt, was a box of letters, love notes, recipes, receipts, all written in the same careful handwriting. Each one signed C. They didn't mean much to anyone now, just words from another life. But at the bottom of that box was a photograph, Samuel and Claire, standing side by side on their wedding day, smiling. Only someone had scratched out her face. That photo made its way back to the sheriff. He looked at it for a long time, tracing the edges with his thumb, remembering the man who once said, "Love's a simple thing, Sheriff. You just have to keep your word." He wished he could have told Samuels that sometimes keeping your word costs too much. Sometimes love isn't what saves us, it's what buries us. He placed the photo in a drawer and closed it, like closing a chapter that never quite made sense. But life moved on, as it always does. The hardware store reopened under new ownership. The creek thawed. Children played where the search parties once walked. Yet the story of Samuel and Claire Reed lingered, told in whispers at bonfires, passed down like a warning, not about ghosts, but about choices, about how easily love can turn into something else when greed slips in unnoticed, about how even the gentlest hearts can break in silence. They say the house finally burned down years later. No one knows how. Some say lightning struck it during a storm, others that the new owner started the fire himself, just to be rid of the place. When the flames died, there was almost nothing left. Almost. In the ashes they found two things, a cracked watch, still faintly ticking, and a gold necklace, fused into the shape of a ring, both melted together, inseparable. The sheriff, long retired, visited the ruins one last time. He stood there, hat in hand, staring at the smoke curling up into the night. He said a quiet prayer, not for justice, but for peace, because maybe that's all that was left to ask for. So what do we take from this? Maybe it's that love and greed share the same soil, and what you water is what grows. Maybe it's that some people are never gone. They live on in the things they leave behind. A sound, a scent, a heartbeat you can't explain. Or maybe it's simply this: every secret has an echo, and no matter how deep you bury it, one day it finds its voice again. And so here we are, at the end of a story that never truly ended, a story that began with love, turned to greed, and ended with silence. Samuel Reed's name has faded from the news. The house is gone, and the people who once whispered have found new stories to tell. But somewhere, out there, that story still breathes, quietly, patiently, in the hearts of those who hear it, and feel something they can't quite name. Maybe guilt, maybe sympathy, maybe fear. Now I want to ask you something. If you were Samuel, standing on that riverbank that night, realizing the person you trusted most had taken everything from you, what would you have done? Could you have forgiven her? Or would you have come back too? Not for revenge, but for the truth. And if you were Claire, young, desperate, trapped between love and ambition, would you have chosen differently? Could you have walked away before it went too far? It's easy to say you would from where you sit now. But when life corners you, when fear whispers that you deserve more, when the promise of freedom feels just one decision away, what would you have done? Maybe that's why stories like this stay with us, because deep down, they're not just about Samuel or Claire. They're about us, the choices we make when no one's watching, the lies we tell ourselves to sleep at night, the way love can save us or destroy us depending on what we feed it. So tell me, what do you think happened that night? Do you believe Samuel found peace? Or do you think his spirit still lingers, waiting for the apology he never got? And what about Claire? Was she a monster, or just a woman who made one terrible choice too many? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you believe, and what you would have done if you were in their place. Because maybe, just maybe, there's a little of both of them in all of us. The part that loves too much, and the part that wants more than it should. And if you thought this story was unbelievable, wait until you hear what happened in our next tale, a story of faith, fate, and a promise that death itself couldn't break. Subscribe, stay close, and remember this. The past never stays buried. It just waits for someone to listen.